And welcome into the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner, and today I have a co-host with me. Josh Hayes is going. Josh Hayes, you'll know from our Write a Novel in 60 Days challenge with Dabble, and our current challenge, our Rewrite a Novel, where we're tackling the rewriting process. Josh is one of our panelists there, and he was kind enough to join me today. But our special guest is Mark Greaney, and he has a brand new book out that just released a couple of days ago, or 3 days ago. Burner, the 12th edition of the Gray Man series, and what a fantastic novel! I absolutely love this book, Mark.
Thank you.
You you delivered again,
Thanks so much.
like we expected, but uh, I just can't get over how you keep taking this series to higher and higher steps each time. I love it. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. We chatted about 7 months ago when your latest book, Armored, came out, and what a fun book that was, but a little different
Yeah.
for Mark Greaney fans. It was not a Gray Man novel. It was not in the Clancy verse where we kind of first got to know you. How has that new book, how was it received, and what was it like to get to shift gears a little bit and do something different?
Well, it was received well. It did well. I optioned the rights to in Hollywood to Sony Pictures.
Nice.
So they're that'll percolate there for a while. We'll see
Yeah.
what happens. And my publisher asked me to write another book in the series, so I'm going to work on that in the second part of this year. I'm kind of on tour for Burner right now, and just sitting on airplanes with legal pads, coming up with plot ideas and kind of outlining that second book in the Armored series. So I'll write that by the end of this year, and it'll be out next summer.
I first got to know your name because you got to work with Tom Clancy back before Tom passed away, and not that you need any help in writing, but for I know I have loved the times where I have gotten to work with someone that I considered a mentor and learn from them, and just stand next to them and just kind of absorb, some of that stuff. What was it like to work with someone like Clancy?
Well, at first, I have to say it was really daunting. It was
I bet.
very, very nerve wracking at first. After I had a couple books under my belt, I had a lot more confidence with it. But um, you know, it was never lost on me what was going on. I was sitting in Tom
Yeah.
Clancy's office, and we were talking about, some high tech weaponry or fifth generation fighters or something. And I'm like, this is pretty much everybody that grew up in the 80s or 90s dream, and
100%.
that reads those books. And my dad was also a big fan of Tom Clancy, and he'd passed away. But I was just sitting there thinking, I wish my dad could see me right now. But no,
Right.
he was an interesting guy. We had a nice relationship, and he passed away right after we finished the third book, unfortunately. And I continued the series, but it would have been nice to have done a couple more with him.
I've heard something about Clancy, and I don't know if it's urban legend at this point or what, but there was a lot of talk when he first came on the scene about he has connection, with the CIA or something, because he gets all these details
Yeah.
right. And the saying is, and I have no idea, where this came from, but he was just an insurance salesman with a library card,
Yeah.
and there's a lot that you can glean, from that. But as you have with the details that you put in the Gray Man novels and all of that, do you consider yourself to be um to kind of follow in those footsteps, just an an educated everyman that you can just kind of pick up things if you know where to research, because you don't come from that intelligence background
Right.
that I know of.
Right.
Like how do you prepare yourself from that, and is that a fair assessment?
That is a fair assessment, and it was very inspirational to me as a younger writer to know that Tom Clancy was a 36-year-old insurance salesman who worked in his mom's basement, his mother-in-law's basement, I think, and and then just read Jane's Defense Weekly and other intelligence publications, war gamed, with the board games and stuff, and this is all pre-internet too. So what I do doesn't hold a candle to what he was able to do. He would just reach out and talk to people. He didn't have any military connections before Red October of any note. But once that came out, it was published. The Naval Institute Press agreed to publish it, and I think they did 5,000. And then I guess was it Penguin snatched it up, and then suddenly there were millions, and everybody everybody had a Tom Clancy book in their hand. But yeah, no, he was just so I'm the same thing. I didn't serve in the military. I'm not law enforcement. I have a lot of connections now. I had none when I started writing. And honestly, the first Clancy book that I wrote with him. I was told I wasn't allowed to tell anybody I was writing a book with Tom Clancy, because they sort of had to see the finished product before they knew, even if it was coming out or anything. Right. So there was about 6 months in 2011 where I'm like going to the Pentagon and just trying to get access. And, people knew that I'd written a couple little paperbacks, and at every point I just wanted to scream Tom Clancy, just to get the doors to open up for me.
It's like a little press card you can hold up.
Yeah. So I still remember the day we announced that book was coming out, and I was like, oh my God, I don't have to hide this anymore, because it was killing me to work through most of 2011 without being able to tell anybody that I was writing a novel with Tom Clancy.
When you said favorite, sorry,
no, go ahead, Josh. Go ahead.
I was gonna say my favorite memory of the Hunt for Red October is that my grandfather had I believe it was one of the original 5,000.
The naval press.
The
naval press version.
Yeah. They are out there. I've always wanted a signed one of those. That would be a dream to have.
Oh yeah, I don't know where it is now. I mean, he's gone, and I wish I would have looked into that a little harder. But yeah, it was cool.
Yeah.
That's an epic story. Do you because you said that you now have lots of connections, that you've gathered through the years, does that change of course it changes your process, because now you can just ask directly and sometimes probably get a clear answer, probably sometimes get a cagey answer.
Yeah.
But that obviously changes your research for a book, because you can now just go to the source, or does it?
It absolutely does. There's like a couple of things I want to say about that. One thing is, the first couple Gray Man books I wrote, I didn't have the knowledge that I have now, but you're kind of stuck with the way you set things up in the earlier books. You've built your world in those first books. So there's things now that I'm like, I've got to say he's part of this unit, which doesn't really make sense, but like, why would he do that? But it's kind of inside baseball knowledge, and it doesn't really matter that much. But I like the types of novels that use a lot of research but use it carefully. And so I try not to mine sources and things unless it's something specific, and usually pretty small. It might be like, hey, you fly this type of helicopter, could you reach this from there, or something little like that. I don't, I'm careful. I've been at the Pentagon before, and they've told me that, to stop asking that question in different ways and talk about something else. And, and you said cagey answers. A lot of people do give me cagey answers, but I like those just as much. I mean, honestly, I'm not trying to, rat out anybody in the intelligence community. I always tell people when they're providing source material, I'm like, you really don't have to worry about me. I will get it so wrong and misunderstand so much that you say it's going to be like, even if you accidentally said something you shouldn't, it's probably not going to be exactly right. But it's really fun when you hear from the men and women who do this sort of thing for a living after you put something out, not your sources, but just just readers, and they go, wow, I really like that, or that was very well built up until the point where it got very Hollywood, which is like, that's part of my job too. So, but they acknowledge, that work went into it to get some details right.
Well, you can also use that card, I'm a writer. If you don't tell me, I'm just going to make up something. And they may be like, well, hold on.
Yeah. I literally in my career, I've only had a couple of people that wouldn't talk to me about something.
Yeah.
And a buddy of mine who's a writer, Keith Thompson, it was also a journalist, and right as I came out, he and I were talking, and he's like, he's like, in my X number of years as a journalist, I've always been totally surprised by how much people want to talk if you ask them questions. Right. And I've sort of used that mantra. One time there was something involving the DEA in Mexico where the DEA guy was like, nope, no interest in talking to you whatsoever. And then there was another thing similar to that. But that's like 2 out of 200 people that I've spoken to about these books over the years.
That's wild. In our writers group, we're talking a lot these days and about characters, and with this now being the 12th Gray Man book, is that right?
That's correct.
There are intricate plots and lots of action and lots of gritty stuff going on that people obviously love, but the reason they keep coming back to your books is because of the Gray Man himself, Court Gentry, and the cast of characters that you built. Where First off, what was your first idea for this series? Where did Court come from? And this guy that kind of exists, on some people's radar, but other people, could care less. And how did you come up with this type of character?
I'd gotten a couple of books in front of an agent, in like a guy that I wanted to be my agent.
Yeah.
And he's like, I really like your writing, but your stuff is too, he said it was like a little too much like James Michener or Herman Wouk. And I'm not comparing myself to them. I think he was just saying it was too wordy and dense for somebody that hadn't been published. But he said, you write action really well. So if you write an action, a book, he even said, he's like, just picture a book where there's a guy on the cover standing there with a gun. He's like, that I can publish. So I kind of took that to heart. Every time I would have like a 3-minute conversation with him, which might be once every 6 months, I would just take everything he said to the nth degree, because there I was talking to a very successful agent. And so I was in Guatemala studying Spanish, and went down to El Salvador and was by myself. I went down with like a few other people from the Spanish school, but I was just by myself in a bar, and this American guy came in speaking Spanish, and it just kept to himself, and he just had this look about him. And I was just sitting there drinking a beer, and just sort of like, how the writer's mind works. You're not saying, oh, I want to write a book about this guy, let's make something up. Instead, you're just it's just your natural state to be like, I wonder if that guy's agency, and why is he in
the what if game just starts playing.
Exactly, the what if game. And so then you're like, well, he's agency, and he's down here in the developing world because he's off grid, and he's dressed like he's off grid, and he totally like blends in down here, even though he's not Hispanic. He speaks the language and can move around. And so I don't remember how long, maybe half an hour, maybe an hour, I sat there having a beer or two, thinking about this guy. I never talked to him or anything. And the next day, I'd already kind of had this idea. I wanted this story, like I said, the agent wanted this big action story, but I didn't know who my lead character was. And then once I thought about that a little bit more, I was like, all right, maybe I can fold this guy into some ideas that I have.
I'm curious about the like every book raises the stakes as you go through the series, and more things happen, but you kind of go more granular with your action scenes, and everybody says that you write action scenes very well, which you do. And my question is, very specifically in the very beginning of Burner, Court Gentry is going on his little crusade against the oligarchs, and you have first of all, I love that you let him scuba dive, because I know you're a big scuba guy, and he hadn't done that before, like really in this fashion. But you take the tension of just simply what he's doing, right? Just laying the mines on the ship, but then ramping it up as now he's starting to fight some people underwater, and you ramp that up even more with the ticking clock, and then every time I'm reading it, a scene like that, I think, how is he going to get Court out of it? And in the back of my mind, I'm like, man, I just easy button it and just get him out, but you don't, and you stack more and more, and then by the time Court does get out of it, it's so like kind of a duh moment. Like, of course he would have done that. That makes perfect sense. And it doesn't ever feel like Deus Ex Machina when you're just gonna have something like have a Blackhawk come in and rescue him out of nowhere.
Right.
So when you're writing those scenes, like how long do you take like planning out how you're going to do it, or do you know how he's going to get out of it before you start writing the scene? How do you put something like that together?
It can take all sorts of different times, but I almost never know how he's going to get out of it. I am just thinking about building tension and building tension and building tension. So
Yeah.
he'll be in a fight and then something will go wrong, or equipment fails, or in this example, he starts to drown because the guy's cut his and at one point I think he's breathing the air out of the other guy's tank as they're fighting to stay alive. And it's just as you're building it, as because I do scuba dive, you just think of like every possible thing that could go wrong while you're fighting for your life in the dark 50 feet under the water, and it's fun to think about that stuff. And I just sort of tell myself, come up with a really, really good problem, and then worry about the solution. So it's in my 12 books, I've written my lead character into so many corners that I didn't know how I was going to get out of.
Right.
And I never want there to be, I mean, there's definitely some things that strain credulity, and I'm okay with that, because it's that kind of a story. It's
sure.
It's over the top, but at the same time I try and sell it to you just as much as I possibly can. So that's what all the details do, and that's what all the a lot of the writing does, is like, okay, you've created this situation that nobody can get out of, and sell me on how he gets out of that. So
absolutely,
sometimes I think I'm more successful than others. There's some action scenes where he just shoots his way out, and there's a lot where he has to I never want to do, like, as much as I love like the Daniel Craig James Bond movies, there's like one in I think it was not Spectre, I don't remember which one it was, but he's fighting a guy. It was the second one, Quantum of Solace. The opening of that, it's a great fight scene, but he's in this construction place in Spain or Italy or something, and it's just like an old church, and there's all this construction equipment and scaffolding and ropes and pulleys and all this, and you just there's like a 1 second shot of him going like this, turning his head,
right,
and then he does something with the pulleys and arrests his fall while he spins around and knocks this thing over, and
right.
It's like you can't really do that in these books. You can get away with more stuff in Hollywood. It looked really, really cool, and I'm glad that he did it in the movie. But as I start to write something, it's like I don't want to look like the opening to Quantum of Silence, where he just knows that if he jumps onto the moonroof of that car, he's going to go right through it, and be able to turn. It's got to be a little bit more chaotic than that.
When you say that you don't know how he's going to get out of the situation when you start writing it, do you like when his air is cut, that sets a timer, of some sort, like he's got to get out of this in a certain amount of time. Do you find that you do stuff like that, like set these boundaries where I don't know how he's going to get out, but we know that he's got less than 3 minutes to get out,
Yeah. And in fact, that it's an old writing adage, is like you put a ticking clock in there, and then something speeds up the clock. So in that scene, he's already set these mines that are going off in a couple of minutes, and he's fighting this guy pretty near the mines, trying to get out of there. And so it looks like he's down to his last minute, and then his air gets cut, and then he's down to his last few seconds. And but he has to sort of like come up with ways to sort of engineer himself out of his situation.
Well, and I don't ever find like anything that he does, whether it's outlandish or maybe semi unreasonable, like I don't think any of it is out of character for him as Court, right? Like whatever he does, in the back of your mind as a reader, you're like, yes, I believe that Court could and would do this.
Yeah, and you inside baseball writing stuff, but that's what we're talking about. You build the rules of your world, and then you live in them. And if the rules of your world are a little more loosey-goosey than the real world, then that opens up doors for you. And this agent that I was talking about, he hadn't agreed to represent me, but I told him I was working on something else, is the third thing that I was going to give him. And I asked him if he would just read the opening of it to see if I had a good start. And it was The Gray Man. And he read it, and there's an opening scene where he's a sniper, and he sees some people, he sees a helicopter crash, and he can't get to the survivors of the helicopter crash, or maybe there are no survivors. And just for retribution, he just starts, shooting the the people that had killed these Americans from
Right.
like a mile away. And the agent read that and he came back. He's like, yeah, it's a great start. That's a really cool scene. He just needs to save somebody. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, he just needs to save somebody. I'm like, no, he's a sniper. He's like a mile away. He's like, I don't care. He's got to save somebody. And so at first I was like, wait, I'm trying to do this realistic thing. And there's just no way you can do that. And then I just said, you know, it's my job to find a way to do that.
Right.
So really that did, you know, I worked hard for a reason for him to get close to, and was able to get this one guy out. But at the same time, I also just tweaked the world that I was planning on writing about. It was going to be gritty, super realistic. And then it became gritty, slightly over the top.
Right.
Just in that moment, in the first few scenes of Gray Man. And it wasn't even my idea. It was my agent's idea. Thank God that he gave it to me. But now I'm in book 12 and I will write things and I'll be like, I don't know, if you jumped across those two buildings and you landed, if you're Court's age, late 30s, it's like, it's going to tear your ankles up. You know, it's like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because I've created this world where you can get away with stuff like that.
Well, and as readers, isn't that what we sign up for? You know, if I want to realistically figure out, you know, how this is going to go down with a scuba tank, I can go down to the swimming pool and cut my cord and then, you know, see what happens. But nobody wants that.
Or you can take my word for it.
Or I can take your word for it, or I can, you know, go on an entertaining journey and, you know, it's the same reason we read Jack Reacher novels, you know, like
you are right about
nobody wants to know Reacher, but we all want to read about him.
You're right about 98% of readers. But I get emails from the really pedantic people that, you know, it's that if you don't put something in there, you know, like there was a guy that sent me this angry email of all the errors he found in one of my books. And one of the things was a guy's going up on a Zodiac boat towards the beach. And then it says, you know, he went up to the beach and he's like, you never said that he pulled the outboard motor up before he got on the beach. And I'm like, I never said he went to the bathroom in the 3 weeks that this book takes place. You know, it's like, I can put everything in there for you. I won't, but you know, it's like, I think some people are just really, really pedantic. And I got a really long email the other day about Armored by this guy he was like, well, you didn't go into detail about this FBI guy and you didn't, you know, this FBI officer was like, what was he doing there? Why did you, you know, and you're like, you know, it would have been the 500 page book would have been a 1,500 page book. Right. If my job was to, you know, I'm trying to make a fast paced story and not explain every possible permutation of everybody. It's like, he's in this city because he was, you know, his car ran out of gas or, you know, just like, come up with answers for everything. And so it's a very, very small minority of readers. But early in my career, I would find myself sort of writing in my first drafts, fortunately, just my first drafts. I kind of write things. So, well, now people can't go back to me and say, there's no way that, you know, bullet could have ricocheted like that. You know, it's like, I'm going into 3 pages of detail and it was literally just to cover my butt so I wouldn't get those emails. And you end up editing that out because you're like, all right, those people can't control my writing. It's like, I'm trying to keep this story fast paced.
Well, and I think a lot of,
if it would have been 1,500 pages, you would have gotten the complaints that Greaney, would you just get to the point?
Absolutely.
You know? So,
absolutely. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I think I think a lot of readers appreciate, I know I do specifically, the author leaving a lot to context and how you're reading. And that makes me enjoy the story a lot more because I can imagine it happening, or, you know, different ways. I think Stephen King in his On Writing book said something about like writing is telepathy, in that like he can see a cat on a coffee table in a room and he knows what kind of cat it is. So he can project that to you, but you see a completely different cat on a completely different coffee table in a completely different room.
Right.
And I absolutely love that about like your books. You paint the picture where, you know, like you can see what's going on. You can see the boat he's on or the house that he's in or whatever.
Yeah.
But you can also imagine it in a way that you don't have to spin paragraphs on paragraphs, like saying this was the throw pillow over here or whatever, because I can see the room, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're the only thing that matters when you're writing is the reader's perspective. And there's so many things where if you've got it as a writer, you're able to see your book through a reader's eyes, and like, is this what's the best possible time for them to learn this piece of information, which is really important for the third act, or what is the exact level of detail to orient the reader in the scene, for like an action scene or some sort of like physical location scene. You want to orient them there, and then you want them to sort of forget about. And then another thing that you do writing these types of books is you'll put more detail and scenes earlier in the book as you're sort of establishing things and trying to build a feel and a mood. And at the end of the book, you do this quickening pace. So you're not, when he enters a room, he's not smelling the candle or whatever, he's busting through the room. And so it's just whatever is best for the reader. And you think, I will go like, okay, the reader's going to read this paragraph really quickly, so I'm going to put a bunch of little breaks in it so they slow down and catch this one piece of important information that they might gloss over otherwise. And I'll just put that on its own line. It's his own paragraph. My own grammar rules apply until and you do things like that, and it's all about the reader's experience. It's like you want them to gain this knowledge in the right order and with the right sort of nuance of emotion and all these different things. I'm sure you never get it exactly right, but the proof is in the pudding. If the book does well, then you're like, okay, I got it close enough. Enough for people were able to see it and feel it and have kind of a cinematic reading experience.
Through the years of working on this series, what have you heard from readers? Why do people resonate with this character the way they do?
I think he's an empathetic and a vulnerable guy, as well as being this tough guy. He's very much not tough, except for the scenes where he's tough, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Someone like this probably doesn't exist in the world, because, I've known some really hard charging, Delta Force guys or Team 6 guys and stuff. And that's not what Court is. He is trying to right wrongs, and he has this incredible skill set, but when he goes to another country, he's empathetic about the people that live there. He's mission focused, but at the same time, he'll go off mission to do something that he thinks is right. And I think people respond to that. And his vulnerability is that he's not a superhero. He gets hurt. He doesn't get killed. And people be like, well, why would you read 12 books if you know the guy's going to live? And I'm always like, if James Bond died in the first 8 minutes of one of his movies, I think that would be funny, honestly. For the readers to sit there for an hour and 53 minutes,
like, now what?
Yeah, now what? But
it's just the rest of us just Q making sandwiches or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. The survivors just kind of talking about it. But it's like, there's part of me, like the evil part of me, would love to do that in a book, just for the people that are like, it's so unbelievable that he lives through all these things. Like, okay, I'll kill him on page 9,
right,
and then enjoy that book. But that would be career suicide, so I won't do that. But it is. I think people like the vulnerability, though, that he can get hurt, and he can be emotionally hurt, and he pays an emotional and psychological price for some of the things he does. I always try and take that stuff really seriously. Meanwhile, in the next scene, he takes on 50 bad guys and swings on a jungle vine or whatever. But betwixt and between, you want to think about, how would this psychologically affect you? How would this exhaust your body? How would you hurt when you wake up in the morning? All those things are kind of important aspects of the story, and I think it helps with the character.
The other thing that I like about Court is that you mentioned that he doesn't have the typical like SEAL Team 6 demeanor, Delta Force demeanor, or whatever, and because he basically grew into this, like, this is his whole life. He didn't have military service, so he understands like the military. He knows people of the military. He knows all of that, but he didn't experience it in that way. He kind of got like an outside view of it, and so I think that allows how many more hundreds of thousands of readers to empathize directly with him, because they have also not been in the military or experienced those things. And so they can kind of step into Court's shoes, so to speak, and understand kind of the way he sees it, because that's
Mhm.
also kind of how they see it as well.
Yeah, you want to have that POV of the reader in your lead character when you can. Sierra 6, which was the last Gray Man book I did, there were scenes that took place when he first joined this paramilitary unit at the CIA. He'd been working as a singleton, like a lone operator in Russia, and they pulled him into this basically a paramilitary task force. And every one of the other guys is former this and former that, and he doesn't know any of the acronyms. He doesn't know what they call the chow hall, and all. And he's just annoyed by it all. And they're just flabbergasted that there's a guy who's a really good shooter that's joined their team, even though they think he's too young and doesn't know anything about the military. They're just flabbergasted because that's the only people they've been around. Just as Court has never been around them. That's all they've been around. So there's this kind of thing, like the average reader. If you took the average reader and threw them into into a cage at SEAL Team 6 where they keep all their equipment and everybody was smoking and joking with each other, it's a whole nother language. And I wanted to kind of show that a little bit.
You mentioned killing Court at the beginning of a book, and you kind of like faux did that in Relentless. Like when you first meet Hightower's crew in the beginning, but they're only talking about their numbers.
Yeah.
And in my mind, I'm like, okay, I know who Sierra 6 is. He's gonna come in and then things happen, and then I'm like, wait a minute,
he's a different Sierra 6,
right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so funny. In Burner, and you've used Russia as a set piece in several books, but it's definitely in the forefront of this book. There's a lot going on with Russia around. I don't know if you've watched the news or not.
That's all I do.
And it's kind of hard to escape if you write the kind of books with international espionage, and Russia's just a big player. They have been for decades and probably will be, into the future. Does it ever concern you when you start writing a book that people are going to look for, some subtext there, or are you ever afraid of, dealing with real life issues in a work of fiction, or people thinking that you're dealing with real life? Does that ever, factor into your thinking?
I mean, it factors into my thinking in that I want to do it well and do it, accurately, but it's not any sort of like moral question whether I should talk about real things that are happening. Burner is very much, not one page takes place in Ukraine, and it's not a military novel. There's not a single tank or infantry person in there, but the backdrop of the whole book is the war in Ukraine. And I spent last spring and summer desperately trying to figure out what the lay of the land was going to be the following February. Today is the 1-year anniversary of the war, of the stage of the war. I mean, the war really started in 2014, but I just want to get it as accurate as possible. But I mean, I do have, and I don't want to be preachy about stuff. I mean, this book is pro-Ukraine. There are some pro-Russian people out there. They chase me around on Twitter and stuff like that. But I don't know if they're bots or trolls or just idiots. There's some idiots. Right now Europe is having the largest land war that they've had in 75 years, and it's going on right now. And I think it's worth writing about, especially if you're writing these geopolitical stories. My next book that isn't going to touch Russia at all, because you don't want to get repetitive and redundant, and you don't want to like lose your spark. But I've talked about the Syrian war in a book, and I've talked about the cartel crisis, the Mexican situation, and all sorts of different things. And I like that, because that's what I like to read. I like to learn a bunch of things within a piece of work that's really entertaining. And the entertainment is 90% of it, but the 10% of it fixes you to a reality. And that's just how my books work. I could never write a fantasy novel or something. That just seems so complicated.
Well, one of the benefits to writing a long running series is the world building, if you will. Speaking of fantasy novels, is kind of already done. We know the world that these characters are living in. We know court and all the tertiary characters, and we've got the connections established, and we kind of understand how the world works. So when you start thinking about a new book, where does that process start? Do you start looking at places on the globe where something could spark off, and then how does that affect characters? How do I involve my characters in this thing going on? Like, what do you start doing to kind of unravel what the plot's going to be for the next book?
It's different at different times. There will just be something. Well, early in my career, it was easy because I had 50 ideas, or maybe not 50, maybe 15, because I wrote 15
Yeah.
books. And then, so now, I'm not thinking about 3 Gray Man books from now, what I'm going to do. I have no idea. And I don't have time to stop and think about it. I have to throw everything into the Gray Man book I'm writing right now, and then let tomorrow's problem, happen tomorrow. But there are things within the story arc. All the books are standalone. You don't have to read them in any order, or you don't have to read, the first 11 to read book 12 or whatever. But there are longer story arcs that take place, obviously, in the series, and I kind of know where I want some of them to go, and like some of the problems that different characters are going to have with each other. But that's not a plot for a book. That's not enough to get you to start writing. That's just sort of like, oh, I'm going to fold that into whatever my plot is. So, I'm fascinated by different things. The book 13 in the Gray Man book involves artificial intelligence and robotics, and I'm doing a lot of research on that. And
there's a lot to research right now.
Yeah, there's a lot to research. Somebody said, "Are you going to write a book about balloons?" And I was talking to my agent, and I was going like, I just don't think you could make a balloon look scary on the cover of a book, and it's just doesn't feel like much of a thriller, It's just, unless it's like the balloon in It. That's pretty much the only scary balloon in the world. I don't think
Right.
But yeah, so you're always looking at what's going on in the world and saying, is this something I can or should write about? But I don't look that far down the road. So I don't have this like big plan. It's just kind of like, all right, it's time to write a new book. What's out there? What's interesting? Now you did ask about like locations or looking at the globe. I have written books 100% because I wanted to go to a certain location. I mean, I've located the books there. Deadeye, which was my
Smart
fourth
man.
Yeah. I mean, you just like, how do you not? You can only go on a certain number of international trips. And I had seen that movie, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and I thought Sweden looks so cool, and at winter time, and I live in the South, and if we get a dusting of snow, we all turn into cannibals. We're not used to that sort of stuff.
You hoard toilet paper now.
Yeah, exactly. So
Milk and toilet paper.
I was just like, I want to go to Sweden, and I want to go in winter, and I'll locate a book there. So I had this book, Deadeye, which was the 4th Gray Man book, and it was a kind of a cat and mouse story about a guy who was very similar to Court. They're part of the same team, but he's trying to use Court's identity and do some bad stuff, and Court's trying to stop him. So I could have put that anywhere. Like, that's all I had for a plot. And then I was like, where do I want to do it? It's like, oh, I want to go to Sweden because I went to the theater and saw a girl with the dragon tattoo. It's like, that's where I'll do it. That seems cool. And I wrote Relentless. It all takes place in Berlin. My intention was to go there and live in an apartment there for a few weeks. I've been to Berlin 15 times in my life, and it's a very interesting city. Unfortunately, COVID was going really bad at the time, so I had to write Berlin from Memphis, Tennessee. Fortunately, I'd been there many times, but like my intention for placing the story there was it was a good spy story, and Berlin's like a great city for that. So, you start out with just the thinnest threads of ideas and connections between different things, and then what I always recommend to writers is don't worry about plotting the whole thing out. Don't get riveted in place because you don't have all the answers. All you need is a couple paragraphs on page 1 to get started, or either the opening or maybe not the opening of the book. Some of my books, I'll just think of a piece of dialogue that I want the characters to say to each other, and I'll write that first, and then I start building from there. So that's how I do it.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of people during COVID, a lot of writers learned that there's a lot of details that you can pick up using Google Street View and, going to another city. And those are definitely helpful.
Yeah.
But when you go on location to a place, what are you looking for, listening for, smelling for? Are there things that you're looking to gather, or do you just kind of be in this place and let whatever it is that's unique about this place come to you?
Yeah, there's always specific objectives, but then you literally just have to have all your senses open to what I call the atmospherics of the location and these little things. And I had this conversation with Brad Taylor, who's another thriller author
Yeah.
friend of mine, and he does location research. And we agreed, sort of, we were laughing because we were both saying the same thing at the same time. It's like the reason you do the location research is because you did it once and realized how wrong you were about your preconceived notions of a location. And then you're like, wow, I've got to do it. That, 2 years of COVID, I wasn't able to do any location research. And earlier in my career, I wrote a book called Gunmetal Gray from my couch at home because I had to have two ankle surgeries. And so I wasn't able to go. But yeah, so I used Google Street View and I read stuff and I watched movies from Vietnam and Cambodia and Thailand and tried to get it as correct as possible. So there are resources. There's a resource on YouTube. It's just, you just type in walking in and the name of the city. You can say walking in Saigon or walking in Tokyo or Mumbai or whatever. And then you could just watch hours of people just walking, they're just first person thing of just walking down the street. And then you just see the types of cars and you see the way people talk to each other. And, you can learn a million atmospherics from the internet. But it's nice to go there when you can.
I would not have guessed that you hadn't been in Gunmetal Gray. I would not have guessed that you hadn't been there.
Yeah.
And one of the things I really like about, the different novels taking place in different locations, you get kind of a fresh start. You can kind of get into you don't have to remember where things were in other novels or anything like that. But on top of the different places and locations that you go to, a lot of times you switch up your writing style, like the actual structure of the book. And you've done it most notably, I think it was with 8 when you use kind of a different POV shift with the other ones, but also like in Relentless or Sierra 6 rather, where you're jumping between timelines as a structure thing. And first of all, I love when authors do that because it takes a lot of guts to do that mid-series, right? To try something out. And whether it works or not, it was still, it's obviously still a cool way to explore what you're writing about. Do you like when you wrote 8 and then you went on to 9 or whatever, then with Sierra 6 doing the different timelines, when you have your original plot idea, do you decide then I'm going to do it as just a kind of a regular Gray Man, or do I want to change it up and do different timelines or POVs, or are those just kind of one-off ideas that you're like, I'm going to try this?
Yeah, those were 2 specific instances where I felt it worked for the story. Actually, the second one, Sierra 6, which is the dual timelines, that was a complicated one, not just because it was dual timelines, but you realize that if you're talking about something that your character has done in the past, there's no skin in the game for the reader because they know he's going to live or whatever. Right. So I had to tie it to something contemporary. And I talked to my editor about that, and he's like, good idea. He thought maybe 10% of the book was going to take place in the present, and it was all about something that happened in the past that at the very end you're like, oh, that's who this guy is, or something like that. Yeah. And as I started to design the story, I'm like, what if I do just chapter 12 years ago, chapter today, chapter, are people going to be annoyed by that? But I thought, I want both timelines, the present and the past, to be kind of equally exciting. And I just didn't want it to be when you flip the page and it was a different timeline, people, the wind leaving people's sails. So that made me just build the story that way, and ended up being 2 80,000 word novels that each chapter, even though they were in different timelines, related to something that happened in that chapter. So it came kind of organically by me getting in over my head and digging myself out, if that makes sense. Right. Like, I didn't really think about it. I thought I was just going to write this thing where it's like all this stuff happens in the past and boom, that leads to something in the present. But as I was writing it, I was like, I need the stuff in the present to be cool too. So it turned into 2 different novels. For 1 Minute Out, which was the one that I wrote in first person, third person, the hero is in first person. I thought that I wanted to do that for a while in a book. Court is most interesting when he's playing off of other people and the dialogue and his relationships with other people. And there were big swaths of 1 Minute Out as I was kind of starting to write it, where, or even actually as I envisioned it before I started to write it, where I was like, okay, he's going to be totally by himself. He doesn't have Confederates. He does later in the book, but not people that he's close to, and not people that not native speakers. So the dialogue wouldn't bounce back, the way that court's dialogue can. And so I said, this might be the book to try first person for. And I wrote a few chapters and gave it to my editor, and he said, yeah, I love it. Let's do it. And I will say, it was very well received book. It's my only Gray Man book to hit number 1 on the New York Times list. I've hit number 4 the last couple years. So it did really well. And if you look at like reviews on Amazon, it's got 95% 4 or 5 stars. But I have more people hate that book than any other book that I wrote. Like there's a subset of people that are like, you can't change the rules midstream.
Right.
And maybe you can't. I mean, to some people, maybe you can. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying I see it differently, and that's going to happen sometimes. I've read.
Admittedly, it took me a couple of chapters to get into the flow,
the
and
rhythm.
like, okay,
yeah,
this is where it's at.
And I expected that. I expected it to be really, really jarring. Right after the preface or whatever, where he just kind of like, boom, he's talking to you. Suddenly the Gray Man is talking to you. It would be like, watching every James Bond movie, and suddenly he looked at the camera and started telling you what he was going to do. That would be jarring, right?
Right.
But I thought the reasons made it worth a chance, and I'm happy with it. I can't say I won't do it again. I've gotten a lot of hate mail for it. And I get a lot of people going like, hey, something's different about this book. I'm not sure what it is. And it's like,
well, I think in that book specifically, like he spends a lot of time by himself, like you said, but there's a metric crap ton of that book that is super dark, like especially with the material and the stuff that you're dealing with in that book. And so I think not having that levity that his POV brings to the book could have made it like just an extremely, extremely dark book. And I think having like the different sides of that helps like push through. Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I don't think I thought about that, but yeah. So if you were just in regular third person while he's by himself, while it involves sex trafficking and just really horrible stuff.
Yeah.
If you just saw him doing it, and then you got a little bit of the omniscient narrator saying what he was thinking, I think you're right. I think it would have been just kind of this cold, dark story, because it is at its core. But once you have him kind of like explaining his thought processes and, the humor that is able to be woven in there, I do think it brings some life or humanity or something to a story that probably wouldn't have had a lot otherwise. So that's a good point. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier when we were talking, Mark, about how when you were writing that scuba diving scene, that you didn't know how it was going to turn out.
Mm-hmm.
But then a minute ago, you were talking about how you were laying out a book before you were writing it. So talk a little bit, if you would, about your planning process. What does it look like? What does your pre-writing process look like?
Yeah, so it fluctuates. I'm happy. I think I'm happy that I've just written my biggest outline for any Gray Man book, for the one that I'm writing now, and I feel less rudderless than I do in most Februaries or whatever, where you're going like, I've got this really vague, hazy notion of this kind of a story, and now I have a lot of the beats out. I've always written something. Outline wise, or really synopsis wise. It's more like a little story about what happens, and I do it to give it to my editor so we can talk about it. But I also, I like to build out something. But then what happens is we'll talk about it and be like, oh, he'll be like, that's great, I'm looking forward to it. And then I don't ever really read it or refer to it. It's not like source material or anything. It was just something that I built on the page to get my head around what I'm going to be writing. And I think probably the reason I don't go back and read it is because if I did go back and read it 1/3 of the way in, I'd be screwed up, because I do make changes on the day. So it's literally kind of, it's not so much a roadmap as it's a guy on the corner like pointing in that direction saying keep on going. I wish it was more of a roadmap. I have this, and I say this publicly a lot, and it's like I have the biggest fantasy of being like a super organized writer. Like every book, I'm like, this is the one where I'm going to have this perfect work-life balance, and I'm going to go in and work with a smile on my face and go, I'm kicking butt, and then I'm going to, go do other stuff. But every page, every day is some kind of a struggle, or fits and starts, one step forward, two steps back. That happens throughout the whole thing. I really feel like writing, and I don't think I've said this before, but I need to come up with a better way to say this because I think it's clever. We'll see if it is. You can tell me otherwise. It's not going to look clever now because I don't have a way to say this. But I think writing is one of the only jobs that you never really have an awesome day at it. It's like it's so incremental. I mean, if you're writing a novel, even the day you finish it, what have you done? You finished a draft, which is better than the day before and the 150 days before that or whatever. But still, that it's got more to do. And even when I do my last of my proofreads and my last, things that I send back to the publisher and I turn it in, there's never this like, it's more like, I wonder what's wrong. I wonder what's going to make it wrong on the page, which does happen. So it's almost like every day you're just picking away at a sculpture that, someday it'll be finished, but it's not going to be the way that you thought it was going to be at the beginning. And, it always just feels kind of, you have to do it because you love doing it, because you don't really have successful days. It's not like you're a salesman and you just sold 5 cars or, and had a great day. Right. Yeah. I guess the writing 3,000 words would feel like that or something, but still, oh yeah, I wrote 3,000 words today. I wrote, 0.5% of my book or whatever, 2% of my book. And, I'm gonna have to edit it tomorrow, and it'll probably take me as long to edit it as it did to write it. So,
right. I always like the when you type, you finish your edits or your proofs or whatever, and you sent the final copy in. Yeah. I always inevitably, I'm just like, finally, I'm done with that stupid book. Yeah, exactly. And I don't have to look at it again.
Yeah. Yeah. And then if you're lucky, you don't have to go right to, I always have something else I need to start, but sometimes like last year, I made myself kind of take a couple months off. I was plotting the next book, but I'm not going to just sit there with my Word document open typing. I've got to get my brain, thinned out a little bit before I can take on another one.
So do you know your end point for when you begin writing that first draft? Like, I understand that your outline is fluid as you go, but I guess what I'm asking is, do you use that planning process as kind of to mentally lay out where the story's going, knowing that you'll vary, but you're going to the same place?
Yes, and it's not so much a specific ending. It's just sort of like, I don't know if the villains are going to live or die, or how successful or unsuccessful they're going to be. That just kind of happens on the day. I kind of like endings that are a little bit melancholy and not so like everything tied up with a neat little bow. So, it's always a crapshoot how the story is going to end. It's not always going to be that the evil is vanquished and the hero, rides off on a horse. But I do have some sort of view that, like, all right, this book is going to set him up for the next book where he's doing something else with the CIA because he didn't do it in the last couple books, or, I want him to see his father again, so I want to set that up beforehand. So you kind of have these little points along the road, and one of those points is kind of the end, and you don't have it very well mapped out, but you kind of go like, yeah, okay, so there'll be some sort of big thing. I like this 1 Minute Out, for example. It's like, I wanted it to end up, it started like in Bosnia with sex trafficking, and then it led all the way to like Beverly Hills or Hollywood Hills or something. And I wanted to show that it was a worldwide thing, and this wasn't like swarthy people in another country doing something bad. This is like us too. And so I saw that at the beginning, but I didn't know that there was going to be this big fight at this house, and the villain was going to get cornered by, the sister of the woman who, he kidnapped. All these different things that all just came along as I was writing.
That a few months ago, a lot of people met Court the Gray Man for the first time on Netflix, because we got this great Gray Man movie starring
Ryan Gosling.
Ryan Gosling.
Ryan Gosling. Thank you. I was thinking the blonde-headed guy. I can't think of his name. And what a fun movie that was. Not exactly like a Gray Man novel.
Yeah.
But a lot of fun all the same.
Yeah.
First off, how do you feel Netflix handled your character? And it has to be exciting to know that it's almost like a calling card for your series of books. Is that how you look at it?
That is 100% how I look at it. I say it's kind of the best commercial that I could have for my novels. And as far as how Netflix handled the character, I thought they did the Gray Man perfectly. They did Court Gentry or CR6 perfectly in the story. Like I thought Gosling was great. He didn't overdo anything. It didn't get cheesy or schmaltzy. He didn't go for like a tough guy demeanor. He just went for the demeanor exactly as I write the Gray Man. It's like,
right.
He really doesn't want to be doing this. He'd rather be sitting on his boat,
Right.
And I thought they nailed that. Story wise, I think it's 60% of what I wrote in the book and 40% different things. And some of those different things I totally get. I mean, I really get them all, but it's a $200 million film, so they couldn't make it as gritty because you wouldn't have the wide viewership that they needed for something like that. So they made it a little more James Bond or Fast and Furious or whatever you want to say, and a little less edgy. But I really like the fact that the books and the movie are different in that there's still a reason to read a book if you see the movie. And if you've read the books, you see the movie, you're not just getting kind of a rehash of what you read on the page. Yeah. I think that would be cool. And I think my fans that don't like the movie, that's what bothers them, is like they saw it very differently in the page, when they read it. But I think it's fine that they're different. It is a stylized version of what's in the books, and I'm happy with it.
I kind of like that it's different because inevitably when Page gets put on film, something's always wrong. Like it never matches up exactly. That you miss out on important scenes that were in the book or
there's a shorthand.
Right. And so I think that, like, if it had been, let's just say it was based on exactly what happened in the first book, they wouldn't have been able to do all of the stuff that you did in the book. And so it wouldn't have measured up anyway. And so there would have been a lot of people going, oh, you didn't do this, or you did this. Because it's its whole other thing. You can enjoy that for just its whole thing. That is its own Gray Man story and its own Gray Man area over there. And all of the books are their own stories as well. So you don't have like, I liked this version of the story better. It's a completely different, in my mind anyway.
Lee Child used to say, to people that didn't like the Tom Cruise Jack Reachers, he's like, well, the books are still there on the shelf and they look exactly the same as they did. And I've literally had people in interviews ask me if I'm going to change my books to follow along with the movie, and I look at them like they're idiots. It's like I'm like, what? Why would I do that? It's like, I didn't do anything wrong. I don't have to go back and fix my stuff. It's like it's just two different things.
Well, and the audiobooks exist, which is kind of this perfect thing between you holding a book and reading it and watching a movie. You kind of get this mixed experience, and
I listen to all of them on audiobook, like all the way through, in a row. And I thought that the performances were fantastic.
Yeah, he's so good.
And I listened to the audio production of Armored before the book came out. And I absolutely loved that.
Oh, I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did. Most people did. The people who didn't, it's kind of like 1 minute out. The people that didn't like it, they didn't like it.
The thing that that I had to as a writer, I had to force myself to go, I know why they did that, even though it's like, when there's a chase near the end of the book where they're in the armored cars or the trucks, and because everything happens through dialogue. the character is like, I'm gonna get in the front seat and drive.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And as a writer, you're like, come on, that's on the nose dialogue and all that stuff. But
Exactly.
as a listener to this, I understand why
No other
it
way
was
to do
there.
it.
And
Yeah.
100%. And it made sense in how the action was flowing and all of that stuff. And it didn't feel ham-fisted at all.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great production.
Thank you. So I wrote that, obviously. But I agreed to write this audio play based on a screenplay I was working on and was never going to finish because I didn't have a contract for it, and screenplays are hard, and I always have books to write. So they're like, "We'd love you to do an audio play." I was like, "All right, look at this, and if you like it, I'll turn that into an audio play." And they liked it, and then I was like, "All right, let's turn it into an audio play." And like, on page 1, I'm like, oh my God, how do you do this? This is
right.
And they had sent me scripts and I'd listened to other audio plays. So I figured it out pretty quickly, but it ended up being 618 pages.
Wow.
And it's every audio cue I put in there. You have these moments where you're going like, oh, I just want to put a narrator in here and explain. And but I couldn't. You can do that, but I think it would have just made it cheesy. So the scenes just open up, and you have to do these little dialogue cues for people to know what's going on. And some of them are a little hokey. I did do things like everybody in the armored vehicle could see out a different porthole. So they had to keep telling each other what they saw.
Yeah.
And that was just a mechanical thing that I had, I had to do. I created, so it moves away from what's going on with the action to the hero's wife, who's been, is being interrogated by the FBI. You assume after the fact until the end, and you realize it's all happening at the same time.
Right.
And that was all put in there as a device to orient people with what's going on. In the novel version I wrote after that, none of that happens. I mean, she's interviewed by the FBI, but at the place in the story where she would be.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, this has been a very fast hour. Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Mark's brand new book, Burner, is available everywhere now. You can go grab it in hard copy or audiobook, as we were talking about, or Kindle edition. It's available in every edition that you want to grab. We'll put links to all the places where you can get it in the show notes of this episode. Mark, if people want to read up on everything that you're doing, you have a massive back catalog that people can dig into. Where can they find you and dig into all that great stuff?
I'm on social media, but also my website is markgreaneybooks.com, Greaney books.com. And that you one click and you'll see all the books that I've written.
Excellent. We will link that up as well. Mark, thank you so much for taking time to come on.
You bet. This was fun. I enjoyed this.